Hi, everyone. So, hopefully, everyone's doing well and you guys can hear me as I've added myself to the screen. I won't be able to really read chat tonight because of the way that I set up everything, but I feel like the crackling is a little too loud. So, let me adjust that because I don't want people who have earphones in to get like scared. I don't know, in their sleep. I want them to be really relaxed. So let's adjust. What do you guys think of that? Can you still hear it as like for ambiance? Wait, I have to see chat for this. How are you guys? Can you hear me? Hi, Zav. Hi, Bammy. Hi, Dark Sea. Hopefully, everyone can hear me. Yeah, if it's too loud, hold on. Let's see. Let's take it down a notch. Okay, because it'll get dark here in a minute. It's still 4 o'clock my time, so I'll be reading for about 2 hours. And you know what? Actually, I was going to show some pictures and share my screen before we start to kind of give you guys a visual of what this guy looks like. So, yeah, let me kind of get close here. Okay. I'm not a lefty, but so Robert Ressler, if you guys don't know who he is, tonight we're reading Whoever Fights Monsters, which is one of the books he wrote. This is the cover. This is it's a first edition, so I have it like in Mylar. So it kind of like, but Robert Ressler started the behavioral science unit within the FBI with John Douglas. And there was a series out on Netflix called Mindhunter. I believe it was like 2018, 2019. And that was kind of depicted how they started. And it was looked at as a pseudoscience when they started. And Robert Ressler came up with the term serial killer. And he spent a lot of time interviewing killers in prison after they'd been apprehended to kind of try to come up with a way to profile these guys. So we'll see how far 2 hours takes us, but definitely the first chapter, he's going to be talking about Richard Trenton Chase, who was Sacramento's vampire killer. And he had his crime spree in the late 70s. And I was going to share. Hi, Steph. Hi, Cement Shoes. Hi, Batman. Okay, so I'm just going to share. We don't do that here on my channel, but I just want to give you guys so you'll have a picture and you can look him up a little bit later. But so you'll have like a little bit of a visual of who we're talking about. Thank you for joining me, everybody. Hopefully, those that are here for the ASMR and falling asleep and relaxing are getting themselves ready by, getting their favorite drink, getting their comfy clothes on, getting their blankets, settling in. So these are 4 of the 6 of Richard Chase's victims. Teresa Wallin, she was 3 months pregnant. Evelyn Moroth, Jason Moroth, and David Ferrari. So let me show you a picture of this guy. I think it's up here a little bit. So here is Richard Trenton Chase, and he's a very scary looking man, even for how everyone was in the late 70s, how people kind of were pre-grunge, if that's a term. Like everyone just came out of the 50s and 60s where things were really tight, buttoned up, and people like to grow their hair. So this is on, I don't know, medium.com. So it's just I just wanted to show you the pictures and of what he looked like and what his victims looked like. So when I'm describing it, you guys can have a visual. And as it gets dark here, I'm wearing my comfy robe. So as it gets dark here, you guys will see more of the light show. Hi, Pink Dahlia. Okay. So we're going to get into this right now. Okay. If that fireplace is too loud, we could turn it down yet again. This mic picks things up very well. Won't know until I play it back, like how bad it is. Okay. So with Ressler working for the FBI, he had Frederick Nietzsche's saying above his desk. It was one of the sayings that he had. He really liked it. And a lot of his books have the title Monster in it. And you guys have all heard this. I'm sure somewhere you guys have heard this famous saying. So I'll read it to start this book. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process, he does not become a monster. And when you look into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you. And Ressler had to take these words very seriously because he was constantly going into the minds of the most depraved psychopaths and sociopaths that existed. Chapter 1. Russ Vorpagel was a legend in the Bureau. 6'4" and 260 pounds, a former police homicide detective in Milwaukee who also had a law degree and was an expert in sex crimes and bomb demolition. His job as Sacramento coordinator for the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit took him up and down the West Coast, teaching local police about sex crimes. And he had a lot of credibility to do so because cops and sheriffs appreciated the depth of his knowledge. On a Monday night, January 23rd, 1978, that local police confidence had translated into a call to Russ from a small department north of Sacramento. A terrible homicide had been committed, one that was far beyond the ordinary murder in terms of the violence done to the victim. David Wallin, 24, a laundry truck driver, had returned to his modest suburban rented home after work about 6 p.m. of January 23rd and found his 22-year-old, 3 months pregnant wife, Terry, in the bedroom dead, with her abdomen slashed. He ran screaming to a neighbor's house, and that neighbor called the police. Wallin was so upset that he could not talk to the authorities when they arrived. The first policeman who entered the home, a sheriff's deputy, was similarly shocked. Later, the deputy said that he had nightmares for months from viewing the carnage. As soon as the police had seen it, they called Russ for help, and he called me at the FBI training academy at Quantico. Disturbed though I was about the murder, I was also intensely interested because the case seemed as if it would provide me with an opportunity to use the technique of psychological profiling to catch a killer almost as soon as he had struck. Most of the time, when a case was sent to the BSU, the trail was long cold. In Sacramento, it was very hot indeed. Articles in the newspapers the next day reported that Terry Wallin had apparently been attacked by an assailant in the living room of the house as she was preparing to take out the garbage. There were signs of a struggle from the front door to the bedroom. 2 bullet casings had been found. The dead woman was clad in a sweater type blouse and a pair of pants. Her sweater, bra, and pants had been pulled away from her torso, and her abdomen had been slashed. The officers at the scene told reporters that they could not determine a motive for the death and that robbery had been dismissed as a motive because nothing had been taken. In fact, the details were far worse than that, but Russ told me they were being withheld from the public so as not to cause a panic. Many people often think of the police as rather tough and heartless men who like to shove the public's nose into the dirt so taxpayers will know what the cops themselves have to deal with every day. Not in this instance. Some details were kept in-house to spare the public unneeded agony and fright. There was another reason for withholding information as well: to keep private certain facts that only the killer would know, facts that might later prove valuable in an interrogation of a suspect. What the public was not told were these details. The major knife wound was a gaping one from chest to umbilicus. Portions of the intestine had been left protruding from it, and several internal organs had been taken out of the body cavity and cut. Some body parts were missing. There were stab wounds to the victim's left breast, and inside those wounds the knife appeared to have been moved about somewhat. Animal feces had been stuffed in the victim's mouth. There was also evidence that some of the woman's blood had been collected in a yogurt container and drunk. The local police were both horrified and mystified, and Russ Vorpagel was alarmed too, because from what he knew of sexual homicide, it was clear to him, as it was immediately obvious to me, that we had to act quickly. There was a distinct danger that the killer of Terry Wallin would strike again. The high level of violence reflected in the ghastly crime scene made that almost a certainty. Such a killer would not be satisfied with one homicide. An entire string of killings might follow. I was due to go out to the West Coast to teach at one of the road schools on the following Monday, and we'd made arrangements that would allow me to arrive on the Friday before that, though on the same taxpayer nickel, and help Russ look into this crime. It was going to be the first time that I was able to go on site with a profile, and I looked forward to it. Russ and I were both so convinced of the likelihood of the slayer striking again, however, that we shot back and forth a bunch of teletypes, and I did a preliminary profile of the probable offender. Criminal profiling was a relatively young science or art then, a way of deducting a description of an unknown criminal based on evaluating minute details of the crime scene, the victim, and other evidentiary factors. Here, in the original and not entirely grammatical notes written at the time, is how I profiled the probable perpetrator of this terrible crime. White male, aged 25 to 27 years, thin, undernourished appearance. Residents will be extremely slovenly and unkempt, and evidence of the crime will be found at the residence. History of mental illness, and will have been involved in use of drugs. Will be a loner who does not associate with either males or females, and will probably spend a great deal of time in his own home, where he lives alone, unemployed. Probably receives some form of disability money. If residing with anyone, it would be with his parents. However, this is unlikely. No prior military record, high school or college dropout. Probably suffering from one or more forms of paranoid psychosis. I had plenty of reasons for making such a precise description of the probable offender. Though profiling was still in its infancy, we had reviewed enough cases of murder to know that sexual homicide, for that's the category into which this crime fit, even if there was no evidence of a sex act committed at the scene, is usually perpetrated by males and is usually an intraracial crime, white against white or black against black. The greatest number of sexual killers are white males in their 20s and 30s. This simple fact allows us to eliminate whole segments of the population when first trying to determine what sort of person had perpetrated one of these heinous crimes. Since this was a white residential area, I felt even more certain that the slayer was a white male. Now I made a guess along a great division line that we were in the behavioral science unit were beginning to formulate. The distinction between killers who displayed a certain logic in what they had done and those whose mental processes were, by ordinary standards, not apparently logical. Organized versus disorganized criminals. Looking at the crime scene photographs and the police reports, it was apparent to me that this was not a crime committed by an organized killer who stalked his victims, was methodical in how he went about his crimes, and took care to avoid leaving clues to his own identity. No, from the appearance of the crime scene, it was obvious to me that we were dealing with a disorganized killer, a person who had a full blown and serious mental illness. To become as crazy as the man who ripped up the body of Terry Wallin is not something that happens overnight. It takes 8 to 10 years to develop the depth of psychosis that would surface in this apparently senseless killing. Paranoid schizophrenia is usually first manifested in the teenage years. Adding 10 years to an inception of illness age of about 15 would put the slayer in his mid-20s age group. I felt that he wouldn't be much older for two reasons. First, most sexual killers are under the age of 35. Second, if he was older than late 20s, the illness would have been so overwhelming that it would have already resulted in a string of bizarre and unsolved homicides. Nothing as wild as this had been reported anywhere nearby, and the absence of other notable homicides was a clue that this was the first killing for this man, that the killer had probably never taken a human life before. The other details of the probable killer's appearance followed logically from my guess that he was a paranoid schizophrenic and from my study of psychology. For instance, I thought this person would be thin. I made this guess because I knew the studies of Dr. Ernest Kretschmer of Germany and Dr. William Sheldon of Columbia University, both dealing with body types. Both men believed there was a high degree of correlation between the body type and mental temperament. Kretschmer found that men with slight body builds, aesthetics, tended toward introverted forms of schizophrenia. Sheldon's categories were similar, and I thought that, on his terms, this killer would be an ectomorph. These body type theories were out of favor with today's psychologists.
They're 50 years old or more, but I find, more often than that they prove to be correct, at least in terms of being helpful in suggesting the probable body type of a psychopathic serial killer. So that's why I thought that this was bound to be a thin and scrawny guy. It was all logical. Introverted schizophrenics don't eat well, don't think in terms of nourishment, and skip meals. They similarly disregard their appearance, not caring at all about cleanliness or neatness. No one would want to live with such a person. So the killer would have to be single. This was the line of reasoning. Also allowed me to postulate that his domicile would be a mess, and also to guess that he would not have been in the military because he would have been too disordered for the military to have accepted him as a recruit in the first place. Similarly, he would not have been able to stay in college, though he might well have completed high school before he disintegrated. This was an introverted individual with problems dating back to his pubescent years. If he had a job at all, it would be a menial one, a janitor perhaps, or someone who picked up papers in a park. He'd be too introverted even to handle the tasks of a delivery man. Most likely, he'd be a recluse living on a disability check. I didn't include some other opinions in the profile, but I did believe that if this slayer had a car, it too would be a wreck, with fast food wrappers in the back, rust throughout, and an appearance similar to what I expected to be found in the home. I also thought it likely that the slayer lived in the area near the victim because he probably would be too disordered to drive somewhere, commit such a stunning crime, and get himself back home. More likely, he had walked to and from the crime scene. My guess was that he had been let out of a psychiatric care facility in the recent past, not much more than a year earlier, and had been building up to this level of violent behavior. Russ took this profile to the several police departments in the area and they started pounding the pavements looking for suspects. Several dozen policemen rang doorbells, talked to people on telephones, and so on. Media attention on the case was high and focused on two questions: who had killed this young woman? And even more puzzling, why? More details continued to surface over the next 48 hours. Sacramento is the capital of California. Terry Wallin had been a state worker on a day off. That Monday morning, she'd cashed a check at a shopping center within walking distance of her home, and there was speculation that the killer had seen her do that and had followed her home. Her mother had called Terry's home at 1:30 in the afternoon and had gotten no answer, and the coroner's office said Terry had been killed prior to that time. The coroner's office also was of the opinion that some of the stab wounds had been inflicted prior to Terry's death, but that fact was not told to the public. The men in charge of the investigation put out the word through the news media that the killer probably had had blood on his shirt as a result of the crime and asked anyone who had seen a man with blood on his shirt to call a special number. On Thursday, the North Sacramento area was jolted with the news of more grisly murders. At about 12:30 p.m., a neighbor had discovered 3 bodies in a suburban home that was within a mile of the Wallin murder. Dead were Evelyn Morath, 36, and her 6-year-old son, Jason, and Daniel J. Meredith, 52, a family friend in addition. Morath's 22-month-old nephew, Michael Ferreira, was missing and presumed to have been abducted by the killer. All the dead had been shot and Evelyn Moroth had been slashed in a manner similar to Mrs. Wallin. The killer had apparently escaped from Meredith's red had the killer had apparently escaped in Meredith's red station wagon, which was found abandoned not far from the crime scene. Once again, there was no apparent motive for the crime. The house was reported as not having been ransacked. Evelyn Moroth had been divorced mother of 3 children. One resided with her former husband, and another child had been at school when the slaying occurred. Sheriff Dwayne Lowe was quoted by the newspaper as calling the murders the most bizarre, grotesque, and senseless killings I've seen in 28 years. Murders that had terribly disturbed him. Evelyn Moroth had been a babysitter for the neighborhood, and many of the children and mothers knew her well. Other children had gone to school with the 6-year-old boy. No one could think of any reason for anyone to have killed them. A neighbor who had been friendly with the dead woman told a reporter that she felt like crying. "But I'm scared too. That's awfully close." Residents of the neighborhood watched the local television news to get what details were available, and then came out of their homes to gather in clusters on the street and discuss the matter. It was a foggy night, and with the waiting patrol cars and emergency vehicles and the knowledge of murder in the air, many found it to be an eerie scene. Though the report said shots had been fired, no one could be found who had heard any shots. People were frightened. Although police were trying to keep the information about the killings from causing hysteria, enough of it had leaked out so that doors were being double locked, window shades pulled down. Some people were even loading up their cars, station wagons, and small trucks and moving out. Russ Vorpagel called me as soon as he heard the news. We were alarmed, of course, but as professionals, we had to put aside our sense of horror and decipher the puzzle right away. From a crime scene analyst standpoint, the second group of killings provided important new information and verification of what we believed we already knew about this killer. At this second crime scene, again, these are details that were not immediately made public. The man and the boy had been shot, but had not been molested. Meredith's car keys and wallet had been taken from him. In contrast, Evelyn Moroth had been even more badly molested than the first female victim. She was found nude on the side of a bed, shot once through the head, and with 2 crossing cuts on her abdomen, through which loops of her innards partially protruded. Her internal organs had been cut, and there were multiple stab wounds all over her body, including cuts to the face and in the anal area. A rectal swab showed the presence of significant amounts of sperm. In the playpen, where the visiting baby normally was kept, a blood-soaked pillow and an expended slug were found. In the bath, there was red-colored water, as well as brain and fecal matter. Blood appeared to have been drunk at this location too. Also important was that the stolen station wagon had been found not far away, with its door ajar and the keys still in the ignition. The baby had not been found, but the police were fairly certain from the amount of blood in the playpen that he would not be alive. Using this new information, and with the mounting sense of urgency and the certainty that if not caught, this man would kill again and soon, I refined the profile that I had put together just a few days earlier. The sexual connection of the crimes had become more overt. The number of victims at a single crime scene was growing. The violence was escalating. I was more convinced than ever that the slayer was a seriously mentally disturbed young man who had walked to the crime scene and walked away from the spot where he had abandoned the car. I translated these convictions into a revised profile that indicated the probable offender was single, living alone in a location within 1/2 to 1 mile from the abandoned station wagon. To my mind, the slayer had been so disordered that he had no sense of hiding anything and had probably parked the station wagon right near his own house. I also reinforced the notions as to his unkempt and disheveled appearance and the slovenliness to be expected at his residence. I also told Russ that I believed that before this man had murdered, he had probably committed fetish burglaries in the area, and that once he was caught, we'd be able to trace his crimes and difficulties back to his childhood. We characterized as fetish burglaries those breaking and entering cases in which the items stolen or misused are articles of women's clothing rather than jewelry or other items of marketable value. Often the burglar takes these for autoerotic purposes. With this new profile in hand, more than 65 police personnel hit the streets, concentrating on everything within a half-mile radius of the abandoned station wagon. It was a tremendous manhunt. People in apartments and homes and on the sidewalks were asked whether they had seen a youngish man who appeared quite disheveled and thin. The area of the search was further narrowed when the police received a report that a dog had been shot and disemboweled at a country club close to where the abandoned car had been found. The police found 2 people who thought they had seen the red station wagon being driven in the neighborhood, but even under hypnosis, these witnesses were able to recall only that it had been driven by a white male. The most promising lead came from a woman in her late 20s who had met a young man whom she had known in high school in the shopping center near the site of the first murder, just an hour or 2 preceding the attack on Terry Wallin. She had been shocked at her old classmate's appearance. Disheveled, thin, bloody sweatshirt, yellowed crust around his mouth, sunken eyes. And when he tried to pursue a conversation with her by pulling at the door handle of her car, she had driven away. When the police alerted the area to look for a man with blood on his shirt, she had contacted the authorities. She told the police that the man was Richard Trenton Chase and that he had graduated from her high school in 1968. By then it was Saturday. The police learned that Richard Trenton Chase lived less than a block away from the abandoned station wagon, a mile north of the country club and a mile east of the shopping center. They staked out the area near his apartment and waited for him to come out. At this point, he was only one among a half-dozen likely suspects. He did not answer phone calls to the apartment, and toward late afternoon, the watchers decided they would try a ruse to see whether they could lure him outside. They knew that the killer had a .22 revolver and was not afraid to take a human life, so they proceeded carefully. One went to the apartment of the manager of the project as if to use a telephone, while another openly walked away from the front of Chase's apartment. Moments later, Chase appeared at the door with a box under his arm and started to make a run for his truck. As soon as he began to run, the officers knew they had their man, and they ran to grapple with him. As they rolled about, the .22 came out of his shoulder holster. In their grasp, he tried to hide what was in his back pocket. Daniel Meredith's wallet. The box he carried was full of bloody rags. Chase's truck was near the apartment, and it was a dozen years old, in poor condition, and littered with old newspapers, beer cans, milk cartons, and rags. A locked toolbox and a 12-inch butcher's knife were also in the truck, together with rubber boots with what appeared to be blood on them. In his apartment, as slovenly as could be, were some animal collars, 3 food blenders with blood in them, as well as newspaper articles about the first murder. Dirty clothing was strewn about the house, some with blood on it. Several dishes in the refrigerator had body parts in them, and a container held human brain tissue. In a kitchen drawer, there were several knives that turned out to have been taken from the Wallin residence. A calendar on the wall of the apartment had the inscription, "Today," on the end of January dates of the Wallin and Meroth Meredith murders. The same inscription was on 44 more days spread out over the remainder of 1978. Would there have been 44 more murders? Thankfully, we'll never know. The police were tremendously relieved that the murderer had been caught, for there could be no real doubt that this was the slayer from the evidence he carried and the descriptions that he matched. Everyone was grateful to the FBI and very appreciative of the profile, and some people later said that the profile caught the killer. That, of course, was not true. It's never true. Profiles don't catch killers. Cops on the beat do, often through dogged persistence and with the help of ordinary citizens, and certainly with the aid of a little bit of luck. My profile was an investigative tool, one that in this instance markedly narrowed the search for a dangerous killer. Did my work help catch Chase? You bet, and I'm proud of it. Did I catch him myself? No. The fact that Chase so precisely fit the profile that I had drawn up in conjunction with Russ Vorpagel was gratifying to me on 2 counts. First and foremost, because it helped in the apprehension of a violent killer who would undoubtedly have continued his homicides if not caught immediately. Second, because when the murderer matched the profile, that gave us at the BSU more information on how to evaluate subsequent crime scenes and identify the characteristic signs that murderers leave behind. In short, it helped us to refine further the art, and I do mean the art, because it had not yet approached the status of being a science of profiling. In the days and months after Chase's apprehension, I closely followed the information coming to light about this strange young man. Almost immediately after his arrest, he was connected to an unsolved murder that had taken place in December, not far from the site where the 2 other events. It turned out that I had been wrong about Terry Wallin being the first victim. She was actually the second. A Mr. Ambrose Griffin and his wife had returned home from the supermarket on December 28, 1977, and were taking groceries into their house from their car. Chase had driven by in his truck and had fired 2 shots. One hit Griffin in the chest and killed him. Ballistic research on Chase's .22 caliber gun, taken from him after the other 2 murders, showed that it had also discharged the bullet that killed Griffin. Chase also fit the description of the unknown assailant responsible for some earlier fetish burglaries in the neighborhood, and was pinpointed as the probable abductor of many dogs and cats. Several dog collars and leashes found in his apartment matched up with those taken from missing dogs and puppies from the surrounding area. These dogs and cats were most likely killed for a strange purpose. He may have even drunk their blood, though we could never be certain of that. Computer searches also came up with an incident in mid-1977 in the Lake Tahoe area, when an Indian agent on a reservation stopped and arrested a man whose clothes were soaked with blood and whose truck had guns in it, as well as a bucket of blood. It was Chase. He had gotten off that time because the blood was bovine. He had paid a fine and explained away the blood on his clothes by saying that he'd been hunting rabbits that had blood on his shirt. As reporters and court officers interviewed people who had known Chase and unearthed records about him, the whole sorry history emerged. Born in 1950, Chase was the male child of a moderate income family, thought of as a sweet and cooperative son. At age 8, he was a bedwetter, but this behavior soon ceased. His problems really seemed to have begun at age 12 or so, at the time when his parents began to fight at home. His mother accused his father of infidelity, of poisoning her, and of using drugs. The father, when interviewed, said that these accusations and other loud arguments had to have been overheard by Chase. A later evaluation by a group of psychologists and psychiatrists who interviewed the family labeled Mrs. Chase as a classic mother of a schizophrenic. Highly aggressive, hostile, provocative. The arguments between father and mother continued for nearly 10 years, after which the couple was divorced and the father remarried. Chase was just about normal intelligence, IQ around 95, and an ordinary student in high school in the mid-1960s. He had girlfriends, but the relationships with them were broken off when they got to the point that he attempted intercourse but was unable to sustain an erection. He had no close friends, no long-standing relationships with anyone but his family. Psychiatrists and psychologists who examined him later were of the opinion that Chase's mental condition began to deteriorate in his second year of high school, when he became, quote, rebellious and defiant, had no ambition, and his room was always in a state of disarray. He was smoking marijuana and drinking heavily. One of his girlfriends, who had been close to him, said that he started hanging out with the acid head crowd. He was arrested in 1965 for possession of marijuana and was sentenced to community cleanup work. As these sorts of details were published in the newspapers, reporters and many in the public saw evidence for attributing Chase's murders to the influence of drugs. I disagreed. Although drugs may have contributed to Chase's slide into serious mental illness, they were not a real factor in the murders. We have found that drugs, while present in many cases, are seldom the precipitating factor in serial murders. The true causes lie much deeper and are more complex. Despite his deterioration, Chase managed to graduate from high school and held a job for several months in 1969. It was the only job that he ever managed to keep for more than a day or two. He attended a junior college, but could not keep up with the work or, friends remembered, with the social pressures of college life. In 1972, he was arrested in Utah for drunk driving. This seemed to have hit him hard, for after it, he later recalled, he had stopped drinking altogether, but he was on a downward curve. In 1973, he was picked up for carrying a gun without a license and resisting arrest. He had been in an apartment where a party of young people were in full swing and had attempted to grab a girl's breast. He'd been ejected from the party, and when he returned, the men jumped him and held him for the police. As they did so, a .22 pistol fell from his waistband. Charges were reduced to a misdemeanor. He paid a $50 fine and walked away. He couldn't hold a job and went between his father's and mother's homes and was supported by them. Is the mic doing something weird? I'm sorry that I'm breaking. I just want to make sure that it doesn't continue. I'm breaking. I just want to make, that's naughty. I thought I'd turn that down. I just want to make sure that there's no. What do you guys think? Is it making a lot of staticky noise? Because I kind of hear some static. Yeah, there's a little bit of static. Gosh, I don't know. Okay, I'm gonna take like 2 seconds to adjust, and maybe it will help. Hopefully, because it comes and goes. So I don't know what's going on with it. Just so that everyone has a better like way of hearing it. So I'll be like maybe 60 seconds at the most. Hopefully, only 15. Be right back. Okay, guys, hopefully that fixed it. Fingers crossed. Okay. In 1976, after Chase tried to inject rabbit's blood into his veins, he was sent to a nursing home. Conservators were appointed by the court to take charge of his affairs, thereby relieving his parents of the responsibility. Taking care of Chase was getting beyond the capabilities of many individuals. Conservatorship is also a way of having the state pick up the tab for caring for a mentally disturbed person. Paying the bills privately can otherwise bankrupt any, but the very wealthiest families. On the grounds of the nursing home, according to some of the nurses later interviewed, Chase was a frightening patient. He bit the heads off birds he had captured in the bushes and was several times found with blood on his face and shirt. In a diary, he described the killing of small animals and the taste of blood. 2 nurses' aides quit because of his presence at the institution. He became known among the staff as Dracula. All of his bizarre actions had a reason, at least in Chase's own mind. He believed he was being poisoned, that his own blood was turning to powder, and that he needed this other blood to replenish his own and to stave off death. A male nurse was directed by the staff physicians to put Chase into a room at night with one other patient, and he refused to do so, fearing that if something happened, a distinct possibility, according to the nurse, he would lose his license. Medication seemed to control Chase to the point of stability, and a psychiatrist wanted to release him for outpatient care to make more room for more seriously ill patients. The male nurse later recalled, "When we learned Chase was going to be released, we all raised hell about it, but it didn't do any good." An outside physician later asked for his opinion about what had happened to allow Chase to be released, thought it had probably come about because his medication was controlling him.
The families of the victims in the Chase murders later sued the psychiatrist who allowed Chase out of the institution, asking for considerable damages. Chase was released in 1977, mostly in the care of his mother, who obtained an apartment for him, the one at which he was eventually captured. He spent some time with her, but most of the time he was alone at the apartment. Chase was an outpatient who, who subsisted on a disability check and bragged to people who knew him about not having to work. Some of the bills at the apartment were paid by his father, who also tried to spend time with his son, taking him on trips for weekends, buying him presents. Old acquaintances who bumped into him during this period after his release said he seemed to dwell entirely in the past, to talk of events that had occurred when they were in high school as if they were current, and not to say anything about the intervening 8 or 10 years. He did, however, speak of flying saucers, UFOs, and of a Nazi Party crime syndicate that he thought had been operating in high school and was still after him. When his mother complained about the disarray of his apartment, he barred her from entering it. When his father went to rescue him after the incident near Lake Tahoe, Chase dismissed it as an accident and a misunderstanding by the local police agents of a hunting mishap. That Lake Tahoe incident was in August of 1977. Chase's actions from then until the first discovered murder provide such a clear picture of a deteriorating mind and an escalating series of criminal behaviors that we need to paint them in some detail. In September, after an argument with his mother, Chase killed her cat. Twice in October, he bought dogs from the ASPCA for about $15 each. On October 20th, he stole $2 worth of gasoline for his truck. When an officer questioned him about it, he was calm and denied the charge and was allowed to drive away. In mid-November, he answered an ad in the local paper for Labrador pups, showing up at the owner's home. He bargained successfully to take 2 home for the price of 1. Later in November, he made a phone call to torment a family whose dog he had taken on the street and who had placed an ad in the paper asking whether anyone had seen it. Police received reports of other animals missing in the neighborhood. On December 7th, Chase went to a gun shop and purchased a .22 revolver. He had to fill out a form that required him to answer whether or not he had ever been a patient in a mental institution, and he swore that he had not. There was a waiting period, and he would not be able to pick up the gun until December 18th. During the intervening days, he did some work on re-registering his truck and other tasks that required a coherent mind. He kept articles from the newspaper about a Los Angeles strangler and circled advertisements for free dogs. His father took him to a store to pick out a Christmas present, and Chase accepted an orange parka, which he wore steadily from the moment he obtained it. After picking up the gun from the store on December 18th and buying several boxes of ammunition for it, he began to shoot. First, he fired 1 shot at a windowless wall of the residence of a family named Ferris. A day or so later, he fired through the kitchen window of the house of the Polensky family, parting the hair of Mrs. Polensky, who stood bent over the kitchen sink. 1 shot was fired. Shortly thereafter, Chase fired 2 shots at Ambrose Griffin, one of which killed him. The Griffith home was located across the street from the Ferris house. The shots at Mrs. Polanski and Griffith were hardly random. Later analysis showed that from a traveling car, one would have to fire carefully to avoid hitting the many trees on the Griffith block and to hit the man in the chest. Mrs. Polanski was extremely lucky to be alive. On January 5th, 1978, Chase bought a copy of the Sacramento Bee, which had an editorial about the Griffith killing. He kept this page with its societal condemnation of the senseless shooting. On January 10th, he bought 3 more boxes of ammunition. On January 16th, he set a fire in a garage in order to drive out the neighborhood. In order to drive out of the neighborhood some people whose playing of loud music had annoyed him. On January 23rd, the day he killed Terry Wallin, the police were able to trace Chase's actions moment by moment. Early in the day, he attempted to enter a home in the neighborhood, but he left after coming face to face with the woman occupant at the kitchen window. He then sat on her patio, motionless for some time. She called the police, but he left before the authorities could arrive. Not too many minutes later, the homeowner caught him in the act of having illegally entered another residence. He fled, and the man ran after him down the street, lost him, and then went back to assess the damage. Chase had taken some valuable objects, defecated on a child's bed, and urinated on clothing in a drawer. The latter behaviors were signs of classic fetish burglaries. An hour later, Chase was in the parking lot of the shopping center, where he had met the woman he recognized from high school and who became suspicious of him. He was wearing a blood-stained shirt and had yellow crust around his mouth. Was shockingly different from the boy she had known years ago. She didn't recognize him until he asked her whether she had been on the motorcycle when her former boyfriend, a friend of Chase's, had been killed. She said no and asked him who he was. He told her his name. She tried to edge away and said she had to go to the bank. He waited for her, then followed her to her car and attempted to get in on the passenger side. She locked it and sped away. Minutes later, he walked across the porch of a home near the shopping center, and when the owner called out to him not to do that, he said he was just taking a shortcut. Then he left those premises and entered the almost adjoining home of Terry Wallin. By mid-1978, the body of the missing child had been found, also not far from Chase's last residence. In prison, he'd refused to do much talking. The trial site was moved from Sacramento to Palo Alto, and there were other delays. During the next year, one psychiatrist did manage to gain Chase's confidence enough to have conversations with him, and in one of those, elicited the following rather remarkable confessional statement in response to a question about whether Chase would have continued with his killings. The first person I killed was sort of an accident. My car was broken down. I wanted to leave, but I had no transmission. I had to get an apartment. Mother wouldn't let me in at Christmas. Always before she let me come in at Christmas, have dinner, and talk to her, my grandmother and my sister. That year, she wouldn't let me in, and I shot from the car and killed somebody. The second time, the people had made a lot of money, and I was jealous. I was being watched, and I shot this lady, got some blood out of it. I went to another house, walked in. A whole family was there. I shot the whole family. Somebody saw me there. I saw this girl. She had called the police, and they had been unable to locate me. Kurt Silva's girlfriend. He was killed in a motorcycle accident, as a couple of my friends were, and I had this idea that he was killed through the syndicate.
that he was in the mafia, selling drugs. His girlfriend remembered about Kurt. I was trying to get information. She said she was married to somebody else and wouldn't talk to me. The whole syndicate was making money by having my mom poison me. I know who they are, and I think it can be brought out in a court of law if I can pull the pieces together like I've been hoping.
The trial began in early 1979, and on May 6, 1979, Sacramento Bee reporter Iris Yang described Chase in the courtroom. The defendant has a totally lusterless quality: dull, limp brown hair, sunken, opaque eyes, a sallow complexion, and scarcely a spare ounce of flesh clinging to his bony frame. For the past 4.5 months, Richard Trenton Chase, just a couple of weeks short of his 29th birthday, has sat hunched in his chair, toying with papers in front of him or staring vacantly at the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. There was a trial only because the prosecution vigorously sought the death penalty under a recently reenacted California state law. The defense had wanted to say that Chase was mentally ill and incompetent to stand trial, but the prosecution had argued that Chase had had enough knowing shrewdness at the time of his crimes to be deemed responsible for his actions, and that he must be held accountable for them. He was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. Terry Wallin, the 3 people at the Marath home, the dead baby, and Ambrose Griffin. The jury deliberated only a few hours before pronouncing him guilty on all counts. The judge sent him to death row at San Quentin to await the electric chair. I didn't agree with this verdict nor with the deposition of the case. It occurred in the same time frame as the murders of Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk by former San Francisco City Hall employee Dan White. White claimed he had been made insane by such things as eating the junk food Twinkies, and his diminished capacity defense was accepted, and he was sent to a mental hospital and not given the death penalty. Richard Chase, who was clearly mentally ill and who should have spent the rest of his life in a mental institution, was sentenced to death. While Chase was on death row at San Quentin in 1979, John Conway and I visited him. Conway was the FBI's prison liaison man in California, an exceptionally smooth, good-looking, and polished guy who had a knack for getting inmates quickly into a conversational mood. Going to see Chase was one of the strangest experiences I have ever had. From the moment I entered the prison to the moment I sat down in the room where we would conduct the interview, it was a series of doors slamming behind us, an oppressive and frightening experience. I'd been in many prisons before, but this was the most grisly. I felt I was going beyond a point of no return. Conway was much more nonchalant about it than I. We went up through several elevators, and the final one disgorged us on death row. I heard weird noises, groans, and other almost inhuman sounds coming from the cells. We sat in a room awaiting Chase and heard him coming down the hall. He was in leg irons and clinked as he walked, and I thought immediately of Marley's ghost in Dickens' A Christmas Carol. In addition to the leg irons, he was handcuffed and had one of those security belts with a loop through which the handcuffs were attached. He could do nothing but barely shuffle along. His appearance was another shock. Here was this skinny, odd-looking young man with long black hair, but it was his eyes that really got me. I'll never forget them. They were like those of the shark in the movie Jaws. No pupils, just black spots. Those were evil eyes that stayed with me long after the interview. I almost got the impression that he couldn't really see me, that he was seeing through me, just staring. He showed no signs of being aggressive and simply sat passive. He carried in his hands a plastic cup, which he didn't talk about at first. Since he had already been convicted and was on death row, I didn't really have to go through the sort of romancing that usually characterizes my first interview with a murderer. Ordinarily, I have to work hard to show the interviewee that I am worthy of his trust and that he can talk easily with me. Chase and I talked with relative ease, considering his mental state. He admitted his murders, but said he had done them in order to preserve his own life. He told me that he was fashioning an appeal and that it would be based on the notion that he'd been dying and had taken lives in order to obtain the blood he needed to live. The threat to his life was soap dish poisoning. When I told him that I wasn't aware of the nature of soap dish poisoning, he enlightened me. Everyone has a soap dish, he said. If you lift up the soap and the part underneath the soap is dry, you're all right. But if it's gooey, that means you have soap dish poisoning. I asked him what the poison did to him, and he responded that it turns one's blood to powder, essentially pulverizes the blood. The powder then eats at one's body and energies and reduces one's capacities. Readers may find Chase's explanation laughable or impossibly weird. In this situation, when I was confronted with it, however, I had to react properly. I could not appear appalled or shocked and had to take the explanation for what it was worth, an illusion of the reasoning of a murderer. The rule is you stay out of commenting on the fantasy and, by your comments, urge him to continue. So I couldn't say about soap dish poisoning, there isn't any such thing, because that wouldn't have helped. Neither could I say, oh yes, I know people who've had soap dish poisoning. I merely accepted his explanation and didn't debate him about it. The same principle applied when he began to tell me that he had been born Jewish. I knew that to be untrue, and that he had been persecuted all of his life by the Nazis because he had a Star of David on his forehead, which he proceeded to show me. To this announcement, I could have said, that's baloney, or gone in the other direction and answered, gee, what a beauty. I wish I had one like it. Neither answer would have helped much in that conversation. I saw no Star of David, but I thought his mention of it might be a trap that Chase was setting for me, or a test for how far I was willing to go along with his explanation. He might be tricking me, telling me it was on his forehead when it was really on his arm or his chest, and he wanted to see how much I knew about him. In this instance, I merely told Chase that I couldn't see the birthmark, but I merely told Chase that I hadn't brought my glasses along and that the lighting was dim and I couldn't see the birthmark, but that I accepted his word that it was there. He said that the Nazis had been connected to the UFOs that constantly hover over the earth and that had commanded him by telepathy, I can't say it sometimes, to kill in order to replenish his blood. He summed up his explanation by saying to me, so you see, Mr. Ressler, you see very clearly that the killings were in self-defense. Perhaps the most important information that I obtained from this interview came from a question as to how Chase had chosen his particular victims.
It was a point that had eluded many other Chase's interviewers. But I had gained his confidence enough that he was comfortable telling me. He'd been hearing voices that told him to take a life, and he just went down the street, rattling doors. If a door was locked, he wouldn't go in. If it was open, however, he went in. I asked him why he hadn't simply broken down a door if he wanted to go inside. Oh, he said, if the door's locked, that means you're not welcome. How slim the line between those who escaped being the victims of a heinous crime and those who died awful deaths at the hands of Chase. At last, I asked him about the little cup that he carried. He said it was evidence that the prison was attempting to poison him. He shoved it forward, and it contained some gooey yellow mess that I later identified as the remains of a packaged macaroni and cheese dinner. He wanted me to take it and have the FBI lab at Quantico analyze it for him. It was a gift I felt I could not refuse. The information I gleaned from this interview was helpful in verifying the portrait we at the BSU were already putting together of the disorganized killer, a portrait that is in sharp contrast to that of the organized killer. Chase not only fit the disorganized pattern, he embodied it more than any other individual that I or others in law enforcement had encountered. In that regard, his was a classic case. While at San Quentin, the other inmates taunted Chase. They threatened that if he came near enough, they'd kill him, and told him he ought to commit suicide. Prison psychiatrists and psychologists who examined Chase in those days waited for the brouhaha over the death penalty to calm down, and then suggested that since Chase was psychotic, insane, and incompetent, and chronically so, he ought to be transferred to the prison at Vacaville, California, known as the California Medical Facility of the prison system, the place that houses the criminally insane. I certainly concurred in that judgment. By this time, following up on the notion that the FBI was going to analyze what the prison was feeding him, Chase was writing letters to Conway and to me, conveying to us that he needed to come to Washington, D.C. to perfect his appeal. He was certain that the FBI would want to know what the UFOs were now connected to airplane crashes and anti-aircraft weapons of that sort that were being used against the United States by the Iranians. The FBI could easily detect the UFOs by radar, he wrote me. They follow me and are stars in the sky at night that light up through some type of controlled fusion reaction machines. It was the last I heard from Chase. On Christmas Eve of 1979, Chase was found dead in his cell at Vacaville. He had saved up many antidepressant pills that he'd been given to damp down his hallucinations and make him a tractable prisoner, and had taken them all at once. Some called his death suicide. Others continued to believe that it was accidental, and that Richard Trenton Chase had taken all those pills in an effort to quiet the voices that had driven him to murder and that continued to torment him until he died. That's the end of the first chapter. I'm thinking we could we're not going to finish chapter 2, but maybe we could just read a little bit of it. Okay. We have some time, so we'll just read as much as we can. Chapter 2, Whoever Fights Monsters. There was a monster on the loose in Chicago, and I was intrigued. It was 1946, and I was all of 9 years old. My dad worked in security and maintenance for the Chicago Tribune, so we always had the newspaper around the house. In the Tribune the summer before, I had read about the killing of a middle-aged married woman in an apartment building. It was just an isolated case until the following December, when an ex-wave was killed in an apartment hotel. The killer had written on a mirror in the woman's lipstick, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." From evidence that was too awful to print in the newspaper, and at which I could not even guess, the police thought the killings of the two women might be connected. The Tribune was in the thick of the chase for the killer, sending reporters here and there in search of clues. Shortly after the turn of the year, there was another crime that at first was not thought to be connected to the other two. A 6-year-old girl, Suzanne Deignan, was taken from her room in her house and killed. Her body was found scattered in parts in the sewers in the Chicago Evanston area. All of Chicago was aghast at this grisly murder. Many parents were worried for the safety of their children. I wondered, what kind of person would cut up and kill a little girl? A monster? A human being? As a 9-year-old boy, I couldn't imagine what sort of person would commit a heinous crime, but I could fantasize about catching Suzanne's killer. I suppose I was somewhat afraid, and the fantasy was my way of coping with that fear. But I think I was actually more fascinated than afraid. At the movie houses on Saturdays, I had seen a model I wanted to reproduce. Either in Our Gang or The Little Rascals, by now I've forgotten which, there was a detective agency in the summer of 1946. I formed one with my friends. The RKPK agency had an office in a garage and a war wagon, a wooden structure on wheels that we called the RKPK Express. When we weren't conducting an investigation, we'd use the express to haul groceries, a quarter a delivery. That delivery business was only a subsidiary that we kept going in order to meet our overhead costs. Like most fictional movie detectives, we weren't getting enough cases to pay the rent. Our main activity the summer of 1946 was to put on detective clothes, hats and long coats, and to lurk around the bus stop waiting for a suspect to trail. We were trying to look like FBI men who were heroes to the country back then, or maybe like Sam Spade. When one of the fathers or elder brothers in the neighborhood would get off the bus with his lunch pail or briefcase, we'd assume that this was a suspect in the killing of Susan Deignan and follow him home, then stake out the positions around his house until it was time to change shifts and compare notes. The men would wonder what these goofy kids dressed up in long coats were doing. They never did figure it out. William Hearns was caught that summer, and I found it amazing that he had killed the little girl as well as the two women in the apartments. The reason he gave was that they had surprised him in the course of committing burglaries that were described as sexual in nature. According to the mores of the time, no further details were given. And since I didn't know very much about sex at age 9, I shrugged off that part of the description. Years later, I would learn far more than the average person gets to know about where, in effect, fetish burglaries were. At that time, the most intriguing fact about Hearns, to me, was that he wasn't that much older than I, just 17, a student at the University of Chicago. It later turned out that he had been sane enough after each murderous event to go back to his dormitory room and act calmly enough to avoid detection. His arrest came almost as an accident. when an off-duty policeman was called to stop Herons as he was trying to make a getaway after an unsuccessful burglary. There was quite a scuffle, and the policeman had been extremely fortunate that Heron's gun misfired twice before another officer arrived and was able to smash Heron's skull with a handy flower pot. In his dormitory room, the authorities found souvenirs from his fetish burglaries and the murders. Time magazine called the Herons case the crime story of the century and marveled at how many reporters flocked to Chicago from all over the country to learn about it and to observe the trial. Once Herons had been caught, we 9-year-olds watched the bus stop, waiting for Herons, the dangerous killer, and we played that we were following him to his lair. The fantasy game in our detective agency faded that summer, but in a way I continued even at that age to follow and be fascinated by Herons himself and many criminals like him. And as I grew up, to fall naturally into what became an important part of my life's work, catching and understanding criminals. An average student in high school, I wasn't particularly interested in any one subject, and that attitude carried over into 2 years of ho-hum attendance at a community college in Chicago. Then I joined the Army, got married, and was sent to Okinawa. While overseas, I still received the Chicago Tribune, and in one Sunday supplement read about a school of criminology and police administration at Michigan State. It sounded good. I applied, was accepted, and began a bachelor's program after I finished my 2 years in the Army. Law enforcement interested me greatly, and as a consequence, my grades steadily improved. After completing the undergraduate program, I was accepted for graduate work. I finished only one semester of that, though, before I went back into the Army, this time as an officer, having been in ROTC while at Michigan State University. I had attempted to get a job on the Chicago police force, only to be told that the force wasn't interested in recruits with too much schooling because they might make too much trouble. The chairman of our school had some influence, but the best Chicago would offer, my Chicago patrolman brother-in-law, Frank Grazer, told me privately, was a patrolman's job, which I could have obtained with only a high school education. Frank continued to encourage my interest in law enforcement. The Army, however, offered me a position as a lieutenant in the MPs and a post in Germany. That intrigued me because both my wife and I were of German extraction, and we leapt at the chance to go to the land of our forefathers. I was fortunate enough to receive a choice assignment, that of provost marshal of a platoon of MPs in Aschaffenburg. The town had a population of about 45,000, and our garrison held about 8,000. So I became, in effect, the chief of police for a small town. There were homicides, burglaries, arson cases, the whole gamut of problems that a police chief would see. After 4 years, when I was ready to get out of the Army again, I was offered another plum assignment as commander of a criminal investigation division, CID, unit based in Fort Sheridan, just outside of Chicago, a plainclothes investigations unit responsible for operations in military jurisdictions in 5 surrounding states. I supervised men in and around Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and so on. Contrary to what the general public often thinks about the military, that inside such an organization, talent and drive get lost. The Army had developed ways of trying to intrigue and retain good people by watching them closely and offering them good assignments. I had twice already been the beneficiary of their interest. As I discovered later, the assignment at Fort Sheridan was similar to running one of the FBI's field offices. All my agents wore civilian clothes, carried credentials, a badge, and a 38. In fact, we frequently worked with the local police and the FBI. In in Aschaffenburg, as a lieutenant, I had replaced a senior captain at Fort Sheridan. As a first lieutenant, I replaced a major. One of our largest cases involved my bringing in some agents of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, later known as the Drug Enforcement Agency, to Fort Sheridan to penetrate a narcotics ring. The agents posed as troublemaking enlisted men who had been posted to Fort Sheridan while they awaited dishonorable discharges. The ring was infiltrated, but not without some danger. The undercover men were on the verge of being set up to be ripped off and murdered when we learned of the proposed hit. The finale of the affair was right out of the movies. As all units of the fort were mustered into the company streets for the final inspection before everyone was to get a 3-day pass, my units and those of the FBN and the FBI surrounded the area with cars, trucks, and machine guns. The undercover men stepped out of the ranks, pinned on their badges, and accompanied the commanding officer through the ranks, fingering the dope dealers, who were then led away to the brig. The whole affair left me feeling as if I could continue this sort of work for the government, but as a civilian with the FBI. As commander of the CID unit, I frequently was the host at liaison parties for the various policing agencies with whom we routinely interacted, including the FBI. There were lots of FBI type cases in those days, the mid-1960s. On college campuses, there were beginnings of riots and other anti-establishment activities, some of which spread to young people the same age as college students who were on nearby military bases. My CID agents worked their way into groups that were planning disruptive activities and reported back what they had seen, not just to me, but also to the FBI. Lest the reader think that this was much ado about nothing, I should point out that one of these groups had stolen explosives from Fort Sheridan and was interrupted while planning to bomb some military targets. Several years later, after I joined the FBI, I had occasion to do research into these old cases and learned that the bureau people in the Chicago field office of the FBI had taken credit for the work of my CID investigators. That was a first and a somewhat rude insight into how the FBI sometimes went about its business. There was what FBI insiders called a one-way street in operation. The FBI took from other law enforcement agencies but gave back nothing, ever. I was due to be discharged from the Army and was looking for a way to go further in law enforcement when my status was frozen as a result of escalation of the war in Vietnam. No one of my rank in my part of the armed services was allowed to just leave then. The Army came to me with an interesting proposition. Someone higher up in the service had looked over my records and had seen that I had completed a semester of graduate work. The Army now offered to pay for me to complete my master's in police administration and to continue my salary while I studied, in exchange for signing up for an additional 2-year hitch after I finished the master's program. This time at Michigan State, I had a wife and 2 children along, and in addition to my studies, a secret assignment from the Army, undercover work within the groups that were actively resisting the Vietnam War. I grew my hair long and went to SDS in various left meetings, including marches and so on. Painting myself as a disgruntled veteran, I attended organizational get-togethers and other meetings. There's even a picture of me in a campus newspaper somewhere. long-haired and with my infant daughter perched on my shoulder for additional cover. We were protesting CIA recruiting on campus. I wonder whether that picture of me ended up in the CIA files. I thought these radical protesters didn't know what they were talking about. They hadn't been in the military, didn't know what the military was doing, but were determined that the military was their enemy. Often they seemed to want to disrupt things just for the joy of making a mess. One assistant professor of psychology was hanging around these same meetings, trying to motivate students to protest the war, even suggesting to them that they massively enroll in ROTC in an attempt to disrupt the system. He counseled that while in classes, they should make things difficult for the instructors by asking dumb questions, and that at that time they were supposed to graduate. They refused to take commissions in the armed forces. The assistant professor was soon advised to get a job somewhere else. The classes went quickly and well. Among my cohorts in the graduate program was Ken Joseph, then the senior resident agent of Lansing, Michigan FBI office. Ken stayed on to finish his doctorate while I went back into the Army to fulfill my obligation. After finishing my degree, I served for a year as a provost marshal in Thailand and another year as deputy provost marshal at Fort Sheridan. By now, I was a major and seriously had to consider continuing on in the military as a career. But my friends in the FBI convinced me to reinstate the application I'd made earlier, just before my position in the military had been frozen, and to come into the Bureau. The alternative didn't seem as attractive in 1970, when I was 32, as it had been in 1967. But I certainly liked the sort of investigations I knew the FBI would be conducting. And so I applied in earnest and was accepted. Several of my commanders in the Army tried to talk me out of leaving and touted my prospects for advancement with the CID. But I was enthralled by the prospect of becoming a special agent of the FBI and was no longer listening to reason. I was in trouble in the FBI from the first half hour of my tenure. I had received a letter telling me to report to a room in the old post office building at 8 on a Monday morning in February 1970, and arrived there at 7:50 a.m., bright and eager, only to find a note posted announcing that the class had been transferred to a room at the Department of Justice building, some blocks away. Hustling there, I was met in the halls by agent counselors who, upon learning my name, told me that everything was about to hit the fan and that I should be worried. In the classroom, an instructor was droning on about bureau insurance and retirement matters, and he halted the class to tell me that I was late. I stood my ground, saying that I had been 10 minutes early and had had no prior notice that the location had been changed. He couldn't deal with that. He sent me to a high bureau official. J. Edgar Hoover was still alive and firmly in charge at that time, and Joe Casper, Deputy Assistant Director of the Training Division, was an old Hoover hand. Although Casper was nicknamed the Ghost, for the cartoon character Casper the Friendly Ghost, he was anything but friendly. I reiterated my argument to him that I had been on time, but that the location had been changed. The ghost tried to tell me that everyone had been sent a letter advising them of the room change, and I replied that all I had was a letter telling me to go to the old post office building. He wanted me to admit that I was wrong and had disobeyed orders, and I wasn't going to do that. I informed the official that I'd been in the Army for quite some time and knew all about orders, both giving and receiving them. I thought steam was going to come out of the ghost's ears as he threatened me with being kicked out of the FBI that very minute. I responded by saying that perhaps that would be best for everyone If the FBI was such a nitpicking outfit that it didn't know how to treat new agents who had been so actively recruited, the Army would take me back in a minute, no questions asked. "Raise your goddamn right hand," Casper said to me, and proceeded to swear me in, to advise me to shut my mouth and to warn me that "we'll be watching you." From that moment on, it was a typical attempt to intimidate a new agent. But I was a little older, a little wiser, and a little more used to the ways of the military or quasi-military bureaucracy than the average recruit, and so stood it reasonably well. This experience left me, however, with a bad taste in my mouth for the do it by the book and the inflexibility of the Bureau, an attitude I would continue to fight from that day until my retirement 20 years later. New Agents Class 72 was counseled by two experienced agents in their mid-40s who aspired to higher management in the Bureau and who, as part of the getting their tickets punched, had to manage a class of new agents successfully through 16 weeks of training. As I learned, theirs was a high risk for high gain proposition. For if the new agents didn't pan out, the counselors could be headed for oblivion rather than for desk jobs at headquarters. Joe, O.C. Joe O'Connell, was well known for his work against organized crime figures. A multi-million-dollar lawsuit was pending against him for bugging mob members. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. He didn't seem too worried about that, but he did have a bee in his bonnet about the white shirts, the non-affectionate name for headquarters supervisors. These supervisors would come to lecture about various violations of the laws that FBI agents were to administer. And after one had come and gone, O.C. Joe would tell us to throw away the notes we had just taken and that he would help us prepare for the test on that particular law. He also told anyone that needed extra help to see him in the hall. Today I look back and recognize that those agents who did regularly see O.C. Joe in the hall for additional guidance because they truly needed help were nevertheless the ones who progressed well up the management ladder, while many of the smarter agents toiled in the fields for years and never made supervisor. The other counselor was Bud Abbott, nicknamed Shaky because of his nervousness. What he was nervous about was the anti-establishment attitude of O.C. Joe. Because the two men shared this particular class, their fates were tied to one another, and Shaky, a rather standard bureaucrat, was worried that O.C. Joe's antics would sabotage his own attempts to land a headquarters job. Eventually, both men went on to higher management. So I guess we must have done well enough to satisfy the powers above. After training, I put in several years of field work as a special agent based at the FBI offices in Chicago, New Orleans, and Cleveland. During those years of the early 1970s, the Bureau had opened the new FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, the last positive legacy of J. Edgar Hoover, who had championed the building of what was to be the world's finest training facility for law enforcement personnel. Ken Joseph, who had been tapped to come to headquarters and help in the setting up of Quantico's programs, and in 1974, he pulled me in the setting up of the Quantico. He pulled me in from Cleveland. At the FBI National Academy, FBI NA, I began as a class counselor for the visiting policemen. Each instructor handled about 50 students, shepherding them through the several-month program. By June of 1974, I was convinced I should make a stay at Quantico part of my FBI resume. The academic environment was attractive.
as was the beautiful Virginia countryside. And I also thought that a stint at Quantico was imperative if I was to go up the ladder into higher FBI management. Another factor luring me to Quantico was the fledgling behavioral sciences unit, then consisting mainly of two senior men, Howard Teton and Pat Mullany, a Mutt and Jeff team. They always taught together and were quite a pair, with Teton, the 6'7", thin, straight man, and Mullany, a 5'10", slightly chubby comic. Teton, quiet, low-key, and methodical, and Mullany, quick and energetic, devoted most of their time to teaching, but now and then analyzed a violent crime and profiled the appearance and behavior of likely suspects. They were my mentors in profiling, and within a few years, when they retired, I took up the mantle of chief profiler. Learning to profile was an ongoing process, part of trying to understand the violent criminal mind, something I was also pursuing personally in another way in my lectures at Quantico about abnormal and criminal psychology. The people who commit crimes against other people, crimes that have nothing to do with money, are a different breed from the ordinary criminals whose motivation is profit. Murderers, rapists, and child emmers aren't seeking monetary profit from their crimes. In a perverse, though sometimes understandable way, they're seeking emotional satisfaction. That makes them different. And to me, that makes them interesting. At Quantico, I taught subjects ranging from abnormal psych to interviewing techniques. And I discovered that I was a pretty good teacher. I also learned that I liked being an instructor. We got to go on the road for our training sessions, both nationally and sometimes internationally. And while travel can be wearing, we did journey to some interesting places overseas and met a great many law enforcement personnel. It was at one of these international sessions that I coined the term serial killer, now much in use. At that time, killings such as those of Son of Sam killer David Berkowitz in New York were invariably labeled stranger killings. This term didn't seem appropriate to me, however, for sometimes killers do know their victims. Various other terms had also been used, but none hit the nail on the head. I'd been invited to participate in a week of lectures at Bramshill, the British Police Academy, and while there, I took the opportunity to attend the other seminars and lectures. In one of them, a man was discussing what the Brits called crimes in series, a series of rapes, burglaries, arsons, murders. That seemed a highly appropriate way of characterizing the killings of those who do one murder, then another, and another, in a fairly repetitive way. And so in my classes at Quantico and elsewhere, I began referring to serial killers. This didn't seem to be a big deal at the time. It was part of our overall effort in trying to get a handle on these monstrous crimes, of seeking ways of comprehending them so we could move more quickly toward apprehending the next serial killer. Now that I look back on that naming event, I think that what was also in my mind were the serial adventures we used to see on Saturdays at the movies. The one I liked best was The Phantom. Each week you'd be lured back to see another episode because at the end of each one there was a cliffhanger. In dramatic terms, this wasn't a satisfactory ending because it increased, not lessened, the tension. The same dissatisfaction occurs in the minds of serial killers. The very act of killing leaves the murderer hanging because it isn't as perfect as his fantasy. When the phantom is left sinking in the quicksand, the viewer has to come back next week to see how the hero gets out of the difficulty. After a murder, the serial murderer thinks of how The crime could have been bettered. Good heavens, I killed her too quickly. I didn't take time enough to have fun, to torture her properly. I should have approached her in a new way. I thought up a different way of sexually assaulting her. When he follows this sort of train of thought, his mind jumps ahead to how he could kill more nearly perfectly the next time. There's an improvement continuum. That's not how the public imagines serial killers, however. Most people conceive of the murderer as being a kind of Jekyll and Hyde. One day, he's normal, and on the next, a physiological drive is taking hold. His hair is growing, his fangs are lengthening, so that when the moon is full, he'll have to seize another victim. Serial killers are not like that. They're obsessed with a fantasy, and they have what we must call non-fulfilled experiences that become part of the fantasy and push them on toward the next killing. That's the real meaning behind the term serial killer. That's where we'll leave off. And we will pick up learning more about Robert Ressler's time with Quantico FBI, at Quantico with the FBI. Next time, hopefully next week. Maybe if I could get it together this week. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I wasn't able to check with chat while I was reading. How are you guys doing? I'll say a quick hello and then say good night. Oh, look at that fire. Hopefully it was good. Sav Girl, Diana Wright, Bammy, Kaylee Gilster. Did you guys enjoy that? It gets right into stuff that we always talk about, right? Dark Sea. Yeah, and I feel like this book is going to be more than 4 parts. So we'll see. And then, at the end, I always put it together in a playlist so people can use it to sleep or read it through, however. Batman, margaritas and palm trees. So moving the mic over there kind of stopped it from making a whole bunch of racket. So maybe this isn't completely a promise. Hi, Casey. Maybe we might just quickly cover Richard Trenton Chase on Zab's channel this coming week. If you guys are interested in that. Would you guys be interested in that? I don't know. Yes, Zab girl. Yes, I don't know if I could hear all the details about the animal stuff, but I liked how he didn't really go into it. I was like not remembering. I read this book when it first came out, and I want to say it came out in actually let's just the book's right here. Let's figure out when it came out. It came out in 92, guys. So I don't think I read it in 92, but I didn't read it. I probably read it, I'd say 95 or something like that. And it's been a while, so it's kind of new to me too. So yeah. But yes, so we might talk about him a little bit if you guys are interested in that and you'd like to learn. And most of you guys that are listening are subbed to Zav Girl, but if there's anybody who isn't subbed to Zav Girl, Zav, do you want to put your link in really quick. You probably don't even know your link. Or Dark Sea. I don't know if Stephanie's still with us. Somebody can put the link in. And she just did a really beautiful tribute to Summer, who had her birthday a couple of days ago. Just turned 6. So yeah, we can talk about him a little and look at his blood blenders that they found. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the Twinkie man got into a mental institution and this guy was sent to death row because he's nuts. Are you getting it, Zav? Are you getting your link? Most people are sub to you, but there could be somebody who checks in later that might want to hear more about Richard Trenton Chase. Yes, Bammy. She did such a great job with the summer tribute. She's so good with putting words and images together. So I hope you guys had a really, really great Sunday. If Zav doesn't put it in, hold on. Actually, let me do it. I can do it too. Hold on. Batman, we love you too. Okay, I have to go in this time into my and not look at it from the StreamYard side. Oh, Dark Sea, thank you, love. Awesome. So there's a link. If anybody isn't subbed to Zav for any weird reason, go there and sub to her. We will be talking. We do true crime cases there, and we'll do this. We'll talk about the vampire killer of Sacramento, hopefully this week. You guys enjoy your Sunday. It's very windy here. You could hear the wind and the branches hitting the trees. The branches hitting the windows while I was reading. I don't know what it sounded like that was happening, but yeah. So enjoy your Sunday, you guys. Thank you so much for being with me. You guys are awesome. Yay. Yes, it's windy here. Frenchie, mama. I know, I hope maybe someone doesn't listen to this. And while they sleep, if somebody did listen to this while they slept, I hope you have peaceful dreams. Thank you, Dark Sea. Thank you, all the mods and everyone, for being here. Have a very good night. See you guys soon.